Hi there. I hope you guys have all had a good reading week, and I'm looking forward to getting together to chat about the assigned readings and some of the videos that you're going to be watching before we meet at 10 o'clock on Tuesday. I wanted to take a few minutes and just touch on some key points with regard to the readings about Jean Vanier this week. So I'm just going to start the slideshow and we can chat about this. There we go. So this week we're going to talk about intellectual disability and community and to a certain extent personhood, but we're going to be moving into conversations about personhood in a more significant way in the weeks to come, particularly with regard to the work of Peter Singer, who really challenges some of our thoughts about personhood in some interesting, compelling, and troubling ways. But I'm going to start today. As always, I throw up a picture of my kids because, hey, I'm a mom. So this is actually one of the last pictures of my three boys taken together before Matthew died. So Matthew's in the middle, of course, in the wheelchair, and those are his two brothers on either side. And this was taken at his younger brother's prom night. Okay, so just to highlight the conversation about L'Arche. For those who don't know about L'Arche, I just wanted to take a few minutes to orient you to what L'Arche is. So L'Arche is a community of people with intellectual disabilities who live in community with people who do not have intellectual disabilities, who assist with their care, but also form friendships and essentially live together uh, in a meaningful way. They try to de-emphasize this idea of people who need care and the staff who are taking care of them, but rather emphasize this notion of all people living together and bringing their unique gifts to share. And those gifts can take many forms. This was a community that began in France by a man named Jean Vanier. He's a Canadian. Um, Jean Vanier actually was a professor of philosophy, I believe, at the University of Toronto in, I think, the 60s. And sometime around the mid 60s, I'd have to double check the dates, he was in France and went to visit an institution where people with intellectual disabilities were housed. And I mean that quite specifically. It's debatable whether they were even cared for. And it was pretty awful, and he was quite traumatized. And after this, he took three men home with him to live in community. As it turns out, one actually he returned to the institution, but two remained. And this eventually became the model of what would become L'Arche. And L'Arche is now a global organization where people with intellectual disabilities live in community based houses with people who do not have intellectual disabilities. And it's based, as you could tell from your readings, on this idea of mutual respect, mutual contribution, the acknowledgement of all people's gifts, and this idea that we're all interdependent. And we've talked about that a little bit in the weeks leading up to this week. This idea that independence maybe is a bit of an illusion, that in many ways, none of us are truly independent. We all require supports and nurturing and the engagement of other people. And some people need it more and some people need it less, and our needs shift over our lifetime. So he's really using these ideas to form this L'Arche community. It's based on Jean Vanier is Roman Catholic, and it's really based on the Beatitudes, which are the blessed are the mourn, blessed are the vulnerable. Maybe I'll put that up in the posts in my learning space so you can take a look at it. Now, as you've noticed, certainly in Burghart's reading, there are a number of critiques of Jean Vanier and of his writings. One of the key critiques, and you'll have noticed this when you read the chapter in his book, Becoming Human, he emphasizes this idea of brokenness. And certainly in his earlier writings, he really emphasizes this idea that people with intellectual disabilities are broken, they are needy, they are rejected. He eventually sort of evolves in his writing to argue that we all share these qualities, and that people with intellectual disabilities remind us of that. Um, but many people take some exception with the language he uses to describe people with intellectual disabilities. The other concern is this idea of the thought of colonizing narrative. So this idea that rather than allowing people to tell their own stories, people who are more powerful tell the stories of people who are less powerful, and they tell it in such a way that it serves the needs of the powerful. So an example would be the next bullet point, and that is people with intellectual disabilities and people with disabilities or tragic stories are a conduit to God. And this is a bit reminiscent of Stella's TED Talk, where she talks about people with disabilities being inspiration porn and providing inspiration for those of us who maybe don't have disabilities to, be grateful for our abilities. This idea of the critique of the charitable model comes up once again, and I know a few of you highlighted that as an interesting point of tension in previous readings. And this idea that Vanier emphasizes care and so taking care of someone who is lesser than, rather than creating opportunities for advocacy and empowerment. And I'm hoping maybe in our discussions in the second hour before Wendy arrives, that we'll be able to maybe unpack that a little bit. And then, of course, these concerns carry on to a critique around Vanier's lack of attention, Vanier and L'Arche, but really Vanier and L'Arche are often discussed synonymously. Their lack of attention to social justice issues and human rights issues. So again, rather than trying to create a better world and a more just world for people with disabilities, they endorse this charitable model of care. There are some strengths, and I think we need to highlight those. And that is, many people see L'Arche as a model of peace and peaceful relationships and of acknowledgement of the power of gifts of all people. To be fair, and as Burghardt points out, the bulk of those writers tend to be people writing from a theological frame of mind, less so in the secular academic world. So that's one of the concerns. There's no doubt that Vanier really helped along the line of deinstitutionalization for people with intellectual disabilities until his model of L'Arche became widespread. People with intellectual disabilities lived in institutionalized environments, and their lives were sad. Certainly, as a mother, I can say that one of our greatest concerns was that we didn't want our son institutionalized. And I want to acknowledge that many institutions that do provide care are excellent. We wanted to try to find something else. And I think the other thing that L'Arche did, and again, Burghardt talks about this, but it comes up in the TED Talk too, in terms of particularly around this idea of the guys and the next door neighbors. And this idea of home, that rather than living in institutions, people want a home. And the L'Arche model really tried to create this idea of having a home and being at home, and people with intellectual disabilities belonging to a home rather than simply being housed in these unfortunately large warehouses. Now, unfortunately, these days we can't have a conversation about Jean Vanier without acknowledging the events of February of this past year. And for those who don't know, so Jean Vanier, and again, Burghardt talks about this, Jean Vanier was seen as practically a living saint. He was worshipped while he was, certainly while he was alive, and he was worshipped certainly after his death. He was seen within the Catholic tradition, but broadly within the Christian community as as um, as a saint. He was seen as this truly heroic figure. And Burghardt talks about some of the concerns that his very worshipped status creates. So do people align with L'Arche because they believe in the philosophy or because they're really attracted to the work of Jean Vanier? And even, as you know, when I talk about it, I tend to use L'Arche and Vanier interchangeably. And these days they're trying to differentiate sort of L'Arche from Vanier, but it is difficult because they are often seen as overlapping. But for those of you who followed the news in February, about a year or so after Vanier died, it became known that he had engaged in the sexual abuse of at least 6 women who were support workers at L'Arche. So, not women with intellectual disabilities, but people who lived with and supported people with intellectual disabilities. A fairly rigorous examination was undertaken. I actually was in conversation with people at L'Arche about this because of some writing I had done publicly critiquing Jean Vanier. And it was very interesting, and they were very clear about the fact that they had been very rigorous. And there is, at this point, there is every good reason to believe that he was an individual who had committed serious sexual abuse of at least 6 vulnerable women, and that he exploited a position of power over these women. So that has really complicated the discussions of Vanier. He was seen as this saint and as a huge academic figure in the theology and disability world, and that now has come under great question. And certainly, it's very new. It only happened in February, and of course, we went into lockdown of March. But people are only now beginning to really grapple with how do they make sense of the legacy of Jean Vanier, given his work around people with intellectual disabilities, but also with the knowledge that he exploited a position of power for his benefit. And what does that mean in terms of some of perhaps his other conversations around people with intellectual disabilities? So I've identified a number of potential questions for discussion, and I'm hoping that in that first sort of 30 or 40 minutes before Wendy joins us, that we'll have the opportunity maybe to unpack some of them. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your ideas, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Thanks.